What is going on, Headliner Nation? Jake, Fantasy Headliners. Hopefully everybody's doing well out there today. We're talking about quarterbacks here for Week 8 fantasy football. And if you're an owner of Kyler Murray or Deshaun Watson, you're going to be looking for a replacement. Why? Because they're on bye this week along with Gardner Minshew. And if anybody was using Kyle Allen, you're not going to have him either. But there are a lot of great options here in Week 8, and we're going to get into all the Week 8 matchups here in just 1 second. However, before we do, like usual, holding ourselves accountable, how do we do in Week 7? We didn't do half bad. Out of the 28 quarterbacks we gave a start or sit designation to, 19 of them were correct for an accuracy percentage of 68%. Had a few lower tier quarterbacks really have a solid Week 7, which caused the number to be a little bit lower. Baker Mayfield came out and put on the Bake Show, right? I don't think a whole lot of people were expecting that much from Baker Mayfield. Daniel Jones out there running like a gazelle. Now the world's fastest man, I think I saw somewhere on the internet. Even though he trips over his own 2 feet and can't finish it off, he himself crossed that 18-point threshold, had himself a solid week due to that running upside. Derek Carr continues to impress. Justin Herbert, though, one of our hits of the week. He was my Manscaped must-start last week, and he went out and absolutely killed it. Joe Burrow continues to put up big numbers. And Carson Wentz, we've talked about Carson Wentz a lot here. Say now, even though he has some lower-end wide receiver talent on the roster, he still continues to put up solid game week after week after week. Carson Wentz, another one of the hits last week. But now it's time to get into Week 8 and a few of the quarterback matchups that could have you licking your chops, because some of these guys could actually win you your week here this week. Let's head into the first matchup here on Thursday Night Football. And that's where we're going to find the Falcons and the Panthers. And maybe you remember watching this show just a couple weeks ago where I said, hey, it's Teddy B week, y'all. Well, in that video, his matchup was against the Atlanta Falcons. This week, it's against the Atlanta Falcons, so therefore, it's Teddy B week, y'all, once again, because in that last matchup, he threw for 313 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and the Falcons are still giving up over 28 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. He does have at least 2 passing touchdowns, 3 out of the last 4 weeks, and finally, he's getting DJ Moore involved, which is only raising his floor and his ceiling on a weekly basis. Maybe you're looking for a bye week fill-in. Maybe you had a Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson, and now you need somebody here for this week. If Teddy B's on your waiver wire, he's a great start here once again this week. What about on the Falcons side of things? And Matt Ryan, another week has gone by with another 40 pass attempts, another 300-yard passing game, and it's because of a healthy Julio Jones, right? Julio did not play the last time these two teams met in Week 5, and it was Matt Ryan's worst game of the season thus far. Why is that? Well, not having Julio hurt, but it's also the Carolina defense. As of right now, they only allow 15.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 5th best in the NFL. This is a very tough secondary for opposing quarterbacks, but for his career, Julio Jones averages around 100 yards receiving a game against the Carolina Panthers. Having him back at his disposal for one Matt Ryan is going to raise that floor a little bit and give him that opportunity. If Julio Jones is on the field and he's healthy, big plays are possible. I don't care who the defense is. Wouldn't surprise me if it happened again this week. However, because this defense is one of the better in the NFL, we're just going to lower the ceiling a little bit for Matt Ryan this week. He's going to be a fringe quarterback 1, be in the rankings somewhere right around that 12 spot, but still, with some bye weeks, a solid start here once again in Week 8 for Matt Ryan. All right, move on to Sunday now. Pittsburgh Steelers, Baltimore Ravens, always a fun matchup to watch, but which Lamar Jackson do we get here coming out of his bye week? Because the game before his bye week was his first of the season where he rushed for over 100 yards. Prior to that, he hadn't crossed 54 yards but once. And he's still not really throwing the ball all that well, right? He hasn't thrown for over 200 yards since week 2. Now, yes, they signed Dez Bryant to the practice squad, but we're getting a lot of questions of, hey, does Dez play this week? No, Dez does not play, and even if he did, we still have to make sure that Lamar can deliver the ball to him to put up any numbers, right? That's been a little bit of the problem, has been inconsistencies here to start the season, and this is no easy matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow right around 17 fantasy points per game, which is 7th best in the NFL. It's really hard to sit Lamar Jackson. What you need to do out there is hope that he continues to try to use his feet a little bit more and rack up the rushing yards, because that's what's going to give you the higher ceiling right now, because the passing volume just doesn't seem to be there. You can't sit Lamar Jackson. What about on the Pittsburgh side of things, though, for Big Ben? Because he's kind of cooled off lately, too, right? I mean, the first 4 games of the season, he finished inside the top 15. The last 2 weeks, he's finished outside the top 20. Now, Baltimore does allow over 20 fantasy points per game, which is a plus. And Deontay Johnson, Juju Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, James Conner in the backfield, they all have that big play potential and really gives Ben a safe floor. Now, for his career, Big Ben has averaged 250 yards passing and 2 touchdowns against Baltimore. I'm still starting Big Ben. He's kind of a fringe quarterback 1, high-end quarterback 2 this week, but I don't hate the matchup. He has the potential with those weapons to still put up a solid number again here this week. Rams and Dolphins in the Tua era is here, right? I mean, I have some mixed emotions about that. I kind of wish he would have had the opportunity to just sit out this entire year and really develop. Plus, I love watching Ryan Fitzmagic out there throw the ball all over the field. It's going to be a little bit different, but I'm a big Tua fan, and I'm hoping for him to go out and do big things. Unfortunately, he gets the Rams in his first ever career start, a team known for pressure, right? With Aaron Donald up front, Jalen Ramsey in the secondary, a defense that allows right now 16.9 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 6th best. It's going to be fun to watch him play. This just isn't the matchup that I'm willing to throw him into my fantasy lineup just yet. Can Tua put up some solid numbers the remainder of the season? Yeah, I think he really could, but I want to see it before I can trust it, so we're going to watch and see how he looks on tape here this week. What about on the Rams side of things for Jared Goff? I mean, you'd think you'd see on paper a matchup against the Dolphins and be like, heck yeah, Goff is a must start, but Miami's defense a little bit better than a lot of people want to give them credit for. As of right now, the Dolphins only allow 0.7 points more per game to opposing quarterbacks than the Rams do. And we just talked about how good the Rams defense was. The Dolphins are actually 10th against quarterbacks, so not a bad defense whatsoever. Goff does have at least 2 passing touchdowns in 5 of his last 6 games and has scored at least 17 points 5 out of 7 games so far this season. He's going to be one of those high-end quarterback 2s once again. Not an absolute must start, but a great bye week fill-in if you're looking for somebody here in week 8. On to the Jets and Chiefs now, and this could very easily be the matchup of best versus worst, right? Because for Sam Darnold, you just can't start him for fantasy football, but it makes me feel bad because he's not that bad of a quarterback. He's just in a horrible situation, a horrible offense, horrible play calling, injured weapons. I mean, his main weapon, Jamison Crowder, he's not healthy, and it just really gives him no opportunity to go out there and really be successful consistently, unless he can find a way to really adapt that rushing upside that we've seen at times with Sam Darnold. If that's the case, then maybe he becomes a little bit safer in the future. But right now, this week, no way I could actually start Sam Darnold in fantasy football. He's only finished inside the top 27 once this season so far. Now, what about for Mahomes? 100% start, right? Going up against the Jets, who allow over 19 fantasy points per game. My biggest concern this week with Patrick Mahomes is they get a lead early there, and they really pound the ball with CEH and Lev Bell late, and it really limits the potential upside of Patrick Mahomes. I've seen some rankings out there. A lot of people have Patrick Mahomes as the number 1 overall quarterback this week. He probably won't be my number 1 overall just for this potential limited ceiling here this week, but he's obviously going to be a must start and a positive game script, which we could see him throw for multiple touchdowns in the first half. I just don't know if we're looking for one of those big 4 or 5 touchdown games for Mahomes this week. Expect Lev Bell to touch the ball a little bit more in this revenge game just to kind of stick it to the New York Jets. Moving to Minnesota and Green Bay, a matchup which we saw in week 1, and it was fun to watch, right? A shootout 43-34 game between Cousins and Rodgers. Do we see the same thing here this week? Well, we saw Aaron Rodgers bounce back in week 7 after a poor week 6. Last week, he had a measly 283 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, and no interceptions. Now has 17 touchdowns to only 2 interceptions on the season. Those 2 in that Tampa Bay game, week 6. And Minnesota right now allows over 22 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is 8th most in the NFL. There's no way you sit Aaron Rodgers here this week. The ceiling continues to climb, and with rumors of Will Fuller potentially being talked about going to Green Bay, that's something we need to pay attention to, because if he can add another weapon, the ceiling could be huge rest of season. What about Kirk Cousins? I mean, he's kind of hit and miss, right? He's finished inside the top 10 twice this year. He's also finished outside the top 20 twice this year. One thing that he really has going for him, though, this week that he didn't have in that week 1 matchup is they've really gotten Justin Jefferson going, right? He wasn't really involved week 1, had 2 catches for 26 yards. He's been playing a little bit better than that as of late, and I expect him to be more involved here this week. The Packers allow almost 19 fantasy points per game, making Kirk Cousins a decent start here for Week 8. On to the Colts and Lions now, and this one is going to be a tough matchup to really figure out, right? I mean, on one side, you have a solid quarterback in a very difficult matchup in Matthew Stafford, and then you have an inconsistent quarterback with an easier matchup in Phillip Rivers. Now for Stafford, he's averaging right around 18 fantasy points per game, but he's currently quarterback 22 overall. The reason that ceiling is a little bit lower, the overall numbers are a little bit lower, is the touchdowns haven't been there, right? Not like we've seen in years past anyway. I mean, he's had matchups against Jacksonville and Atlanta, and in both matchups, he failed to get more than one passing touchdown. Those are the type of matchups where we expect those bigger numbers to boost the overall stats there for fantasy football, and he's just not getting it, right? Now he gets a matchup going up against Indianapolis, who allows only 13 fantasy points per game, number 2 in the NFL against opposing quarterbacks. I would prefer to sit Matthew Stafford. The ceiling just hasn't been there thus far in a very difficult matchup. There's just better options, in my opinion, here this week. But what about on the other side of the ball for the Indianapolis Colts and Phillip Rivers? I mean, he's coming off his best game of the season just before their bye week, but that was his first game all season where he threw for more than one touchdown in a game. Now he's going up against Detroit, who allows right around 20 fantasy points per game, but the inconsistencies of the passing game in Indianapolis and their possible dedication to the running game this year is just going to lead me to be a little bit more concerned about starting Phillip Rivers. In my opinion, I prefer to sit both of these guys here this week in Week 8. Moving to the Raiders and the Cleveland Browns now, and I got a question. Is it possible that Baker Mayfield is better without Odell Beckham, as crazy as that sounds? It's entirely possible, right? But maybe by him not having to force feed targets towards Odell, it's opening up the entire passing game, because last week he just looked different, right? Had a huge week, 297 yards passing, 5 touchdowns to only 1 interception. And we know that Baker feeds off success and momentum. And if he can build off of last week's performance, this could be another great week for Baker Mayfield once again, going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, who allow over 23.5 fantasy points per game, 4th most in the NFL. Plus, he's had at least 2 passing touchdowns 5 of his last 6 weeks. We could be in line for another Bake show here in Week 8. Same can be said for Derek Carr, though, right? I mean, he's still being underrated by a lot of people, but he's averaging just under 20 fantasy points per game. He's got at least 2 passing touchdowns every single game since Week 1, and he just put up 284 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, and an interception against Tampa Bay. That's right, the same Tampa Bay defense that made Aaron Rodgers look, like a mediocre quarterback. The guy is playing great, and now he gets a matchup against the Cleveland Browns, who allow over 22 fantasy points per game, 7th most in the NFL. Yeah, give me both quarterbacks in this matchup here this week. On to the Titans and Bengals, and this is where we'll find my Manscaped must-start of the week, Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. Just a quick reminder, after this video is done, head over to manscaped.com. At checkout, use promo code HEADLINERS, all caps. We'll give you 20% off your order and free shipping. Head there after this show, but this is just another one of those matchups where I really love both quarterbacks here. Both of them currently ranked inside the top 11 in fantasy football. They're averaging right around 21 fantasy points per game. Both the defenses in this game allow over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Now, on Ryan Tannehill's side, he's had at least 2 passing touchdowns 5 of his last 6 games. Joe Burrow's only currently leading the NFL in pass attempts and 3rd in passing yards. Both of them have plenty of options on both sides. Plus, they've shown some consistency throwing the football, and that's what we're looking for in a great matchup here this week. I'll fire up both these guys in this game. On to the Patriots and Bills now, and Cam Newton looks not good. I guess is the best way you could possibly say it. Over his last 2 games combined, 255 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 5 interceptions, and it just doesn't look good at all, right? No reports of injury, and it sounds like he's going to be back under center. And he's got a matchup against Buffalo, who allows over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But how can you trust Cam Newton at this point? I mean, we've really been reliant on his rushing upside the first few weeks of this season, and even that has started to become a little bit inconsistent. With only 2 passing touchdowns on the year, I just can't trust Cam Newton in my starting lineup anymore until we can kind of see him turn the corner and start producing more consistently. What about on the Buffalo side of things with Josh Allen? I mean, he's been struggling as of late too, right? Over the last 3 weeks, he's finished outside the top 15 in all of them. Now a matchup against New England, who only allows 15 fantasy points per game, 4th best in the NFL. Is it just because Josh Allen had an easier schedule to start the season that maybe we kind of overhyped him too early? I mean, he had matchups against the Jets, the Dolphins, the Raiders, the Titans, and he succeeded in all of them. Over the past few weeks, starting to struggle a little bit, has a lot of people worried, myself included, that we just don't see that high ceiling more consistently throughout the season. He's still going to be a start for me. He's still a fringe quarterback 1. He's just going to be ranked a little bit lower than he has here in weeks past. Chargers and Broncos, and how awesome has Justin Herbert been here as of late? I mean, since week 5, Justin Herbert is quarterback 5 overall in fantasy football. Now, that may not sound like too impressive, right? But think about it. Since week 5, that's what? 5, 6, and 7. 3 weeks, right? For a lot of people, yeah. For him, it was only 2 games because he had the bye week and he's still ranked quarterback 5. That's how big his numbers have been. Over those 2 games that he's played in that span, averaging 305 yards and 3 touchdowns a game. It's way easier to throw on Denver than it is to run on Denver, and they allow almost 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. I'm looking for another solid week here from Justin Herbert. As for Drew Lock, he's just continued to struggle ever since coming back from his injury, right? Over the last 2 games, he's yet to throw a touchdown, but does have 4 interceptions, and that's not what we're looking for. It's a good matchup going up against the Chargers, who allow over 23 fantasy points per game, which is 3rd most in the NFL, but we just haven't seen a ceiling from Drew Lock in order to trust it, right? Until we actually see it out there and a little bit more consistently at least, it's really hard to trust him in our fantasy football lineups. He's got to start putting points on the board before he starts getting into our fantasy football lineups on a weekly basis. Niners and Seahawks now, and I hate that Deebo Samuel is not in this matchup. Had he been, I may have contemplated putting Jimmy G as my start of the week. Maybe we see a bigger week from Brandon Ayuk or George Kittle, though I just have to limit the upside somewhat this week. Plus, Jimmy G's been a little bit inconsistent as of late. Finished quarterback 9 overall in week 6, then finished quarterback 24 overall in week 7. Not a must start by any means, but in a matchup going up against the Seattle Seahawks, who allow over 27 fantasy points per game, 2nd most in the NFL, it still makes him a high-end quarterback 2 with bye-week fill-in potential for you here this week. Still going to be a start. For Seattle, do I need to sell you on Russell Wilson still? I mean, it's week 8. I mean, I'm pretty sure by now you know just to throw him in your lineup. He's averaging over 30 fantasy points per game. He does have 5 interceptions over his last 3 games played. Is it concerning? Not really. I mean, the volume that he's throwing the football down the field and he's putting up such massive numbers, they're absorbing the negatives of the interceptions, and they're really not hurting you that much. With DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett still in the mix, he's capable of putting up huge numbers once again. Plus, his running game is banged up too, right? Maybe we see the ball going through the air a little bit more. Do not be surprised if you have another huge game coming for Russell Wilson. Saints and Bears, and a lot of Drew Brees owners out there are hoping that Michael Thomas returns soon, but it doesn't look like it's happening soon enough for this weekend. But Drew Brees has continued to show a pretty safe floor by spreading the ball throughout the field. He was even without Emmanuel Sanders last week and still found some other options in that offense, and it's really opening up the entire passing game. Plus, having Alvin Kamara is a huge bonus. This may be his toughest test of the year, though. Going up against the Chicago Bears, they only allow 13 fantasy points per game, the fewest in the NFL to opposing quarterbacks. And honestly, I prefer to sit Drew Brees with no Michael Thomas for that safety in a super difficult matchup. I think it just really limits the ceiling to the point of making him too risky to start here in week 8. Same can kind of be said for Nick Foles, right? I'm really not interested in Nick Foles either. He hasn't had more than 1 touchdown in a game since week 3. This offense as a whole really has no identity in Chicago, right? Matt Nagy has nothing consistent in this offense. I mean, we're hearing quotes come out from Nick Foles that he gets play calls into his helmets that he knows not going to work. That's not what you want to hear from your starting quarterback of your NFL team. Now, even though the Saints allow just about 23 fantasy points per game, Foles hasn't scored more than 18 in a game yet this year, and he's only averaging 14 points a game. Just not somebody who I'm willing to throw in my fantasy lineup here this week. Not worth the risk, in my opinion. Sunday Night Football, Dallas Cowboys, Philadelphia Eagles, and Andy Dalton still not practicing, but does it even matter? I mean, would you really consider throwing him into your starting lineup? With as bad as that offense has looked, with as banged up as that offensive line is, I really don't think it matters at this point. No matter who starts for the Dallas Cowboys this week, not going to be anywhere near my fantasy roster. On the other side of the football, though, for Carson Wentz, yeah, absolutely he's going to be in my lineup if I have that opportunity. He's currently quarterback 7 overall in fantasy football, averaging just over 21 fantasy points per game. Plus, he has 4 rushing touchdowns over his last 5 games. Yeah, sign me up for the Carson Wentz rushing upside 100% because he's also still throwing the ball through the air. He has 2 passing touchdowns also over his last 3 games per game. The guy is putting up great numbers with weapons that a lot of people had no idea who they were just a few short weeks ago. I mean, Travis Fulgham went from a nobody to all of a sudden somebody who's like a dynasty darling that people are trying to go acquire in trades. It's just absolutely crazy. Plus, he's going up against the Dallas defense, who we already know allows more than 20 fantasy football points to opposing quarterbacks. Sign me up this week for some Carson Wentz. That just leaves Monday Night Football, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, New York Giants. And if it's Monday Night Football, that means it's Tom Brady time in prime time, right? And plus, he's been on a roll here over the past few weeks. He's actually quarterback 6 in fantasy football over his last 3 games played. He has 15 touchdowns to only 1 interception over his last 5. No, he has no Antonio Brown yet, and no, he doesn't have Chris Godwin this week also. Do we see a heavy dose of Evans and Gronk, or do we see more running game with Rojo and Fournette? I'm thinking that they probably get a lead in this game and rely a little bit more on the run second half, which is going to limit the potential ceiling of Tom Brady. Do I sit Tom Brady because of that? No, absolutely not. He's still a fringe quarterback 1 this week and going to be a start. What about for Daniel Jones? I'm still not interested, right? I mean, sure, the rushing stats here over the past couple weeks, they really help, but they'd be even bigger if he didn't trip over his own 2 feet. Sure, he looked like a gazelle at times and was, I guess, now the world's fastest man. I read that on the internet somewhere, so it must be true, but he still plays for the Giants in a very poor overall offense. Plus, now he's going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, who's played a lot better here as of late, allowing only 14.9 fantasy points per game. Just can't do it. Gonna sit Daniel Jones here once again. All right, so those are my quarterback starts and sits here for Week 8 fantasy football. Hopefully that helped make a few of your decisions a little bit easier, but I want to remind you, we do updates all throughout the week, right? Things change in the NFL in a moment's notice, so make sure you're also catching our rankings videos and our live shows on Saturday evenings. That's where you're going to get the most up-to-date information. We appreciate the support over there. If you could do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. If you're new here, we would love to have you as a part of Headliner Nation. We look forward to talking to you here this weekend. Have a good rest of your week. Thanks.